How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Ches, Daf 108 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, wow. What a daf, huh? Daf Kuf Ches is unbelievable. Unbelievable. It's like everything you could have dreamed for in a daf. Anyways, the first thing we got to do is we got to finish Daf Kuf Zayin from yesterday. It was Erev Shabbos, and so we have to learn a Mishnah and some Gemara. And its Gemara from yesterday, very interesting topic, the topic of eating meat and milk at the same table. I know that we discussed it at the very beginning of the parak. Now it's a little bit more practical here. We're going to see a sheet of Tosfos, which is very practical and interesting, in my opinion. We will discuss, there are 5 sections to today's daf. That was the first one. Second one, flavor in Issur veheter, the concept of ta'amo v'lo mamashu, ta'am ki'ikr. When it comes to basar b'chalav, when it comes to other examples of Issur veheter, is it d'oraisa? Is it midrabanan? An interesting discussion between Abaye and Rava there. Chaticha naise neveilah. This is a sugya that came up relatively recently. We're going to talk about if a drop of milk falls on a meatball in a pot of meatballs. Classic basar b'chalav example, Issur veheter, ta'am, bittul, all that fun stuff. So that's an exciting sugya. We will discuss the Issur falling into boiling heter. So if you have a meatball that falls into a pot of boiling milk, that is an interesting topic as well. And finally, Issur and heter joining together. Let's say you have basar and chalav really joining together. If you have a half zayis of basar and a half zayis of chalav, can they join together to create a full shear? So chaver, as I'm sure you may be able to I don't know, feel, maybe there's a word that I'm looking for that I can't quite land on, but anticipate. As you might be able to anticipate, this is going to be quite the epic daf. Come join me. Let's have a great time studying Daf Kuf Ches, Daf 108 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin in Daf Kuf Zayin Omid Beis at the Mishnah, about 15 or 20 lines from the bottom. Says the Mishnah, a person can put meat and cheese in one cloth. Just make sure they aren't touching. Two guests at a krechmer. They may eat at the same table. Reuven eating meat, Shimon eating cheese, vein choshishin, and there is no concern there. Says the Gemara, we said in the Mishnah that there were 2 parts of the Mishnah. The Reisha, the first part of the Mishnah, says that you can put cheese and meat together in a cloth as long as they aren't touching. Says the Gemara, who cares if they touch? Tzonin b'tzoninu. They're both cold. There's no issur of basar b'chalav. Basar b'chalav lo sivashal g'di b'chalav. Don't cook. Having a piece of meat and a piece of cheese in a cloth together, even if they touch, it's not basar b'chalav. Hamabai need the klifa lobai hadocha milobai. Says Abai, well, look, in such a case, if the meat and the cheese were to touch each other, you wouldn't have to go crazy. You wouldn't have to start peeling off layers of things, but you would have to rinse them off. So we say, look, if you have a cloth and you have meat and you have cheese, if you don't want to have to worry about dealing with a situation, make sure they aren't touching. And if they do touch, it's not the end of the world. You have to wash them off. But if you want to be able to just not have to deal with anything, make sure that they are not touching, that they each have their own space. Rav Shimon Gamliel had said in the Mishnah that 2 guests at a krechmer can eat at the same tish, they can eat at the same table. Reuven's got his cheese, Shimon's got his meat, and it is not a problem. Amar of Chanan bar Ami, Amar Shmuel Lashanu Ella She'ein Makirin Zeh. This works when they don't know each other. Reuven doesn't know Shimon, Shimon doesn't know Reuven. What they have in common is that they both need a place to sleep for the night. So they find some krechmer to put themselves down for the night. They find they find wherever the Yidden go to Farbrengen, and or not for bringing, I guess in this case would be better. And they find the table, and he sits down and he quietly eats his cheese. Reuven quietly eats his cheese. Shimon quietly eats his meat. Maybe they have a strike up a little conversation, but nobody's at the level where they're reaching over and just without thinking about it, just, Shimon's going to take Reuven's meat, cheese. Reuven's going to take Shimon's. They don't know each other. There's a distance, and there is no concern that they're going to eat each other's basar b'cholov. That they can eat from each other's. Hav makirin zeh also. But if they recognize each other, if they know each other, they're friends, well then there is a concern that they are going to eat from each other, and that would not be allowed. Also in a brayse like this, two guests that were staying at the same kretschmer, Reuven's coming from the north, Shimon's coming from the south. Right, totally different places. They don't know each other. Reuven comes with his meat, and Shimon comes with his cheese. They can eat at the same table, next to each other. I'm sorry. Reuven's eating his meat, Shimon's eating his cheese. And there is no concern, again, because they aren't friends, they're strangers. Now, even when they are friends, and we said that they can't sit together, they can't sit together in one tfisa. It's not exactly clear what a tfisa is. I don't know, let's call it like one wrap or something. Tfisa achas hakadaitek, what do you mean one wrap? If they're all wrapped together, the meat and the milk, it would never be issur, even if they aren't sitting together at the same table. If you have meat and milk wrapped together, so like ke'ein tfisa, it means like a wrap. Ke'ein tfisa achas. What does this mean? So Tosfos says basically this. I can't tell you what tfisa. It's a weird concept to me that they're sitting together. It's like a wrap. I don't know, but I can tell you this. What it does mean is that if you have two people sitting at the same table, you want to make sure that things aren't going to get mixed together. You want to make sure that there's a separation. That's the thing. We want to make sure that there's some level of separation. So says Tosfos, Ke'ein tfisa achas, v'im yesh davar mapsik, but if there's something between them, lo ave ke'ein tfisa achas. I'll tell you this, it won't be considered one tfisa. If there's a separation, you can skip down to four lines. Ulefichach nehagen achshav. I'm reading Tosfos. Therefore, we have the minig now. If you have Reuven and Shimon and they're friends and they're at the same table, Reuven's got his cheese, Shimon's got his meat. Manichin lo lechem o kankan. So between them, they'll put some bread, a pitcher, o sharkelim, some other vessel, something, right? Lahavsik mentain, to create some kind of a hefsik between them. O ochel al mapa. Or use a placemat, okay? Some kind of thing so that there will be an indication of, wait, we have to ensure space and don't eat from each other's stuff. Some kind of a heter, some kind of an indication, a visual indication that hey, we got meat here, we got dairy here, don't mix. Very, very interesting. I think that's the halacha. I think that's the point. That if you're gonna have two people, one person having meat, one person having milk at the same table, do something, whether placemats or some kind of something in between them, some kind of heter as a divider that people that nobody should eat from the others. What if you have two brothers, but unfortunately they are on bad terms and they won't, neither one is going to eat from each other's plate? So then what happens? So Abaye says it's not allowed because it's a low plug. You can't make exceptions because Yomer, they're going to say, Kol asrikin asurin, v'srike baitus musarin. This is a Gemara from Masechta Psachim. It has to do with matzahs that they would design into different shapes or design things on the matzah, some kind of a designed matzah. We have very boring matzahs. We usually either have square matzahs where they all look the same, or round matzahs where I guess each one is handmade and a shtickle unique, but nothing, there's no pictures on them or anything like that. So the shaila in Masechta Pesachim is, can you make a matzah that is designed? The answer is no. You can't make a matzah that is designed. Why? For obvious reasons. We're concerned that while you're designing it, it's going to go past the 18 minutes and become chometz. Now the Gemara asks there, what about, there was this baker. And this baker, his name was Baitus. And he had a good idea. He made a mold. He made a mold where you would just quickly put the dough in the mold, maybe stamp it, whatever it is, and you would get your designed matzahs instantly. You didn't have to cheper over it, pachka over it. All very, very quick. So with Baitos' innovation, you can technically have these designed matzahs without having to be concerned about chometz. However, they said, no, this is a slippery slope. We can't have a situation, yomu kol asrikin asur motek. They say this doesn't make sense. You can't have designed matzahs, but suke baitus mutarin, but baituses are permitted. You can't have this situation where everybody's is osers and one person's is mutter. So here also, we can't have a situation where, in general, families are not allowed to eat meat and milk together, and yet in this particular case they can because they don't get along with each other. There's no exceptions. We have a rule, and the rule is the rule. You can't have the designed matzahs, and you can't eat meat and milk together at the same table, absent some kind of a heter. The time of Amr Reb Ami Reb Yochanan. What about that which Reb Ami Amr Reb Yochanan? What about the fact that Reb Ami says in Reb Yochanan, Misha ein lo ela choluk echad mutal chabs b'chula shamayit. A person, if all he has is one outfit of clothing, and it's Chol HaMoed, and he needs to change it. He went on a hike the day before, whatever it is. He's only got one outfit, and he's got to wash it. He's got to. Now, normally at Chol HaMoed, we don't do laundry. This person's only got one outfit, and the outfit needs to be laundered. So Rabbi Ami says, "Nim Rabbi Yochanan, if all he has is one outfit, he can wash it on Chol HaMoed." But one second, we should apply the same concept there. How could it be that for everybody else you're not allowed to do laundry, but this guy's allowed to do laundry? So we say, no. Yes, this guy can do laundry. The belt is the giveaway. Meaning, normally if a person has multiple outfits of clothing, so on laundry day, you would have clothing to wear, and you would wear your belt with the clothing that you're wearing that day. Okay, so let's say you have, 8 outfits of clothing, and today, or 7 outfits, whatever it is, you're wearing one outfit of clothing today, and you're going to wash the other 6, 7, I don't know, I can't do the math, how many you're going to want to have. Let's just say 7. You have 7 other outfits of clothing, and now it's today's Sunday, laundry day, let's say, and you're going to wash all your other 7 outfits, and you're wearing an outfit today. Baruch Hashem, you have enough clothing. You're going to wear your belt with today's outfit. And therefore, all the clothing being washed is going to be beltless. But if all you have is one outfit, so when you wash that one outfit, you're basically not wearing any clothing because it's in the wash. So you'll wash your belt with the outfit. So basically that'll be the giveaway. So if you're concerned, well, everyone's going to say what? Everyone's prohibited from doing laundry. This guy's allowed to do laundry. It'll be clear. Oh yeah, okay, this guy's belt is in the laundry. Seems that this is all he's got. That's why he's allowed to do laundry, and it's not going to lead to anybody who shouldn't be doing laundry. Givaldig. Okay, fine. So that was basically, I think the big takeaway there was that strangers are allowed to eat together at the same table, meat and cheese. We're not concerned that anybody's going to take from the other one. If they do know each other, make sure you have some kind of a heter, placemats or something in between, something as a divider to make sure that the meat and the milk remain separate. And now we mamish get to just straight up basar b'chalav. Very, very exciting stuff. Here we go. Says the Mishnah. Tipas chalav shenofla al ha-chaticha. You have meatballs You have a pot full of meatballs, 100 meatballs. A drop of milk lands on a meatball. A drop of milk that falls on a meatball. If that drop of milk is large enough relative to the size of the meatball, that the flavor of the milk will be tasted in the meatball. Ba'osa chaticha issur. Okay, in that particular meatball, issur. That meatball is issur. What about the rest of the meatballs? Let's not worry about the rest of the meatballs now. That particular meatball is issur. A drop of milk falls on a meatball. If it's no tam, you can taste the milk in the meatball. The meatball is issur. What if the milk, the drop of milk, fell into the pot, and immediately, before it was absorbed in anything, the pot was all stirred together such that the drop of milk is spread throughout the pot of meatballs. So now, if there is flavor of this drop of milk throughout all of the meatballs, relative to all of the meatballs, issur. Then it's issur. But so long as the meatballs are mevatel the drop of milk, you can't taste the drop of milk in the meatballs, so then it is mutter. So basically, if a drop of milk falls on a particular meatball and is absorbed in that meatball, so then the question of ta'am is for that meatball alone. If the drop of milk fell into the pot and all of the meatballs in the entire pot was mixed together immediately, well then the question is, will that drop of milk be tasted in the entire pot of meatballs? Right? We take into the equation is basically all of the meatballs against the drop of milk. If the drop of milk will not be tasted throughout the entire pot of meatballs, so then it is kosher. Says the Gemara, Abai says Abaye, Shma mina ta'amo velo mamasho be'alma de'oraisa. Says Abaye that what's going on in this Mishnah is ta'amo velo mamasho. What's going on in this Mishnah is that a drop of milk falls on a meatball and is absorbed in the meatball. And the question is, can you taste the milk in the meatball? That's what our Mishnah is dealing with. Our Mishnah is dealing with basar b'chalav. And when it comes to basar b'chalav, we're saying the question is, can you taste it? It's not like, for example, if a piece of pork falls into a soup, so then there's literally a piece of pork in the soup. There's the mamashal, there's the actual piece of pork. Here we're talking about the flavor of the milk. It would be the equivalent of if you pull out the pork from the soup and all you're left with is the flavor from the pork, and the question is the flavor of the pork flavoring the soup? So here, it's a question of flavor. You have basar b'chalav, you have a drop of milk falls on a meatball, and it's a question of flavor. Ta'amo v'lo mamasho. And Abaye wants to say, from the fact that here in our Mishnah, we're saying that by basar b'chalav, it's a question of flavor. Can you taste it? Can't you taste it? And we're saying if you can taste it, it's also midaraisa. If you can't taste it, it's not also midaraisa. Right? Meaning we're not saying that once the drop falls on it, it's automatically also. No, it's a matter of taste. So if there's flavor of the Issur by basar b'chalav, so then it is Issur. Again, on my Abai says, Abai Shmamina, let's learn from here. You can add the word Shmamina. Let's learn from our Mishnah that when it comes to time of lo mamasho, be'alma, then that when it comes to flavor, so for example, by the pork, you have a piece of pork that falls into a soup. Now, you pull out the pork, you remove the pork from the soup. But the question is now, okay, the pork is gone, but what about its flavor? So we say, well, is it no Saint Tom or not? So when we ask ourselves by the pork flavor, can we taste it or not? That is the oraisa. And we learn that out from basar b'chalav. from the fact that basar b'chalav, which is Issur veheter mida oraisa, is checked based on, is defined based on flavor, and that ta'am by basar b'chalav is basar b'chalav mida oraisa. So we'll say that also that all ta'am in general is deoraisa. Now, when we say that if you can taste the pork in the soup, it's also midoraisa. The flavor is going to be also midoraisa. That in general, when we say that if it's no same time, it's also, that's an issur deoraisa. Tamo v'lo mamasho. If you could just taste it, even though the actual pork is gone, if you could taste it, the mixture is also, that's also midoraisa. Because if it enters your mind that by the pork flavor, the soup is also only midirabanon, well then that begs the question, why not deoraisa? It's deoraisa by basar b'chalav. Why not say that just like by basar b'chalav it's deoraisa, so also by the pork flavor it's deoraisa? Mi basar b'chalav my time in logamina. Why wouldn't we be learning it from basar b'chalav then? Tichidishu. Because the only way that we can explain it is to say that, well, basar b'chalav is a chiddush, therefore we can't learn from basar b'chalav. What is so novel about basar b'chalav? You could say a few things that are novel about basar b'chalav. One example, well, meat is mutter, milk is mutter, so I would think you should be able to have meat and milk. No, you can't. Meat and meat together, they're a problem. Individually, they're fine. Together, they're a problem. That's a chiddush. All of a sudden, you take white, right? You take permitted plus permitted should equal permitted, but it's not. It equals forbidden. That's a chiddush. So if we say we can't learn out pork flavor from basar b'chalav, what would be the reason that you can't learn out pork flavor from basar b'chalav? Because basar b'chalav is a chiddush. You can't learn out from basar b'chalav. Well, if basar b'chalav was such a chiddush, chidushu af al gab deleka no sing tam nami. Well, if basar b'chalav is such a chiddush, well then I would say, you know what? Basar b'chalav should be usur by any amount. Right? Don't cook meat and milk together, essentially. Any amount of it. If we're saying basar b'chalav is so novel, let's say that if that drop of milk falls on a meatball, it's immediately usur. Basar b'chalav. But we don't say that. We don't say it's immediately usur. And therefore, the fact that we don't say it's immediately usur, it's only usur once it's no same time. So we're not leaning into the whole chiddush element of basar b'chalav. And therefore, if we're not leaning into the whole chiddush thing, well, let's say, well, that just like basar b'chalav is b'nosing tam, let's also say that pork flavor is also b'nosing tam, and just like by basar b'chalav is doraisa, by pork flavor it's also midoraisa. So therefore, says Abaye, that we see from here, that from the fact that basar b'chalav is b'nosing tam, so when we talk about nosing tam, by all Issur veheter, it's midoraisa. That ta'am v'lo mamasho, ta'am ki'ikr, is midoraisa in general. Amalei Ravis, now Rava disagrees. Now, what does Rava disagree with? He agrees with Abaye that ta'amo v'lo mamasho in general is also midoraisa. Rava agrees that pork flavor is also midoraisa. He disagrees with Abaye's proof. He says, look, Abaye, you could technically argue that basar b'chalav is, in fact, a chiddush, like we said. They're individually, they're mutter, together they're not. You could theoretically argue, based on your proof, it's not really a proof, because you could argue that basar b'chalav is a chiddush, and therefore you can't apply it to pork flavor. Well, if it's a chiddush, then why isn't it just immediately usur? Why do we need tam? I'll tell you why we need tam. Derech bishul asur Torah. It says, lo savashal gedi b'chalav v'mo. Derech bishul. Derech bishul is if you take meat and you cook it in milk, and the flavor of the milk is going to get into the meat. That's derech bishul. Therefore, derech bishul is that there would be flavor and not just immediately usur. That would be based on flavor. So therefore, you could say that basar b'chalav, the reason why it's defined by tam is because derech bishul asur Torah. But we could also say that basar b'chalav still is a chiddush. And we can't apply the requirement of tam by basar b'chalav to pork flavor. So therefore, Rava says, look, to say that tam ki'ikr by other isurim is midoraisa from the fact that we say that ta'am is asur by basar b'chalav is not really a good proof. Although Rava does agree, however, that ta'am ki'ikr being asur by other things is also midoraisa. And now we get up to the exciting sugya of Chaticha naises neveilah, of the meatball itself becoming neveilah. Amar Rav says, Rav kevun shenosan tam b'chaticha, says Rav, that once the drop of milk flavorizes, as we said the other day, I don't know if it's a great word, I don't know if it's a real word or whatever, but it just works really well here. Once the drop of milk flavorizes the meatball, Chaticha atzma naisis neveilah, well, that meatball becomes neveilah. The oseres kol achatichos kulan mipnei shein mina. We saw this the other day on Daf Kuf, so about a week ago. Says Rav that if you have a pot full of meatballs, 100 meatballs in there, let's say, and a drop of milk falls on one meatball, and that meatball becomes contaminated, right, becomes flavorized with milk, and becomes also, we treat that meatball as if it is neveilah. And if it gets lost, I imagine if you can find it, just take it out, and then it's probably fine, as long as none of the flavor got on any of the other meatballs. But if you can't find it, and it's in the mixture, and you don't know which one it is, so the entire pot of meatballs is now going to be asur, because it's min b'mino, and Rav holds like Rabbi Yehuda that min b'mino lo batil. And therefore, says Rav, if that drop of milk flavorizes the meatball, and that meatball is contaminated, that meatball becomes neveilah, and min b'mino lo batil, and all of the meatballs, the entire pot of meatballs, is asur. Amalei mar zutrabre de Rav Mari Ravina, says mar zutrabre de Rav Mari to Ravina. Michdei, 1 second, and we saw this the other week as well. Rav kaman Amar l'shmaitik Rabbi Yehuda de Amar min b'mino lo batil. Rav is saying what he just said based on Rabbi Yehuda's shita, that min b'mino lo batil, that once one meatball becomes flavorized and contaminated and asur, it's treated as neveilah, and all of the meatballs are asur. There's no possibility of bittul, because min b'mino lo batil. But lema pliga adarave, well, if that's the case, that he's saying that the entire pot of meatballs is asur now, well, let's say that this argues on Rava, as we saw the other week. Dama Rava says, Rava, kasav Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda holds, kolshu min v'mino v'davar acher. When you have min v'mino v'davar acher, salik es mino kimishe'eno, so remove mino as if it doesn't exist, v'she'eno mino rabba olav u'mevatlo, and the eno mino is rabba olav u'mevatlo. What does that mean? If I remember, I'll remind us, like I reminded us last week, this was the longest daf in Babble on Talmud history. Daf Chav Gimel Masechta Menachos, 1 hour and 49 minutes, nearly 2 hours. Oh my. Sheesh. Akoponim. That I'm not anticipating that today. I'll call ponim to remind us what this means. Well, according to Rava, he would say, in explaining Rabbi Yehuda, min v'mino v'davar acher. What does that mean? It means you have, let's say, 100 meatballs in the pot. One of them got contaminated. 100 is just a made-up number. It's not like 100 is, shishim is really what's important in theory. But let's go with 100, a nice big number. You have 100 meatballs in the pot. One of them gets contaminated. Okay, so you have min b'mino. You have one contaminated meatball. B'mino, you have 99 other uncontaminated meatballs. We're saying that it doesn't matter that you have 99 other meatballs, because min b'mino lo batil. But you have davar acher. You have the gravy, right? If you're making meatballs, it's probably some kind of sauce. that it's being cooked in. So when you have min, i.e. the contaminated meatball, bimino, with all the other 99 meatballs, vidavar acher, and something else, gravy, you have one meatball, 99 meatballs, and gravy. So salik is the bimino, get rid of the 99 meatballs conceptually, ignore them, and let's just have a look at the sauce and the contaminated meatball. As long as there is enough sauce to be mevatel the contaminated meatball, shishin, as long as it's not nosein tam, so as long as there's enough sauce to be mevatel that one meatball, well then we will say that it is because then it's min b'she'eno mino, right? We ignore the 99 other meatballs. You have min b'she'eno mino, sauce and meatball, and as long as there's enough sauce, it'll be mevatel the meatball. So from the fact that Rav says that once the drop of milk falls on the meatball and flavorizes and contaminates the meatball, and it's now neveilah, so the entire pot of meatballs is Issur. Well, this would argue, seemingly, with what Rava says, which is that we would say min v'mino v'davar acher, that when you have one meatball which is contaminated and is neveilah, 99 other meatballs and sauce, we conceptually remove the 99 other meatballs, compare the sauce to the meatball, and say that the meatball is batel, and therefore the pot of meatballs is kosher. Right, so Lema the Pligad Rav, let's say that Rav is going to be a challenge for Rava. Dom Rava says Rava, Kasav Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbi Yehuda, who says min bimino eno batil. So he says kol shu min vimino, when you have min, the contaminated meatball, vimino and the 99 other meatballs, v'davar acher in the sauce, salik as mino, remove the 99, conceptually remove the 99 meatballs, kemo she'eno, as if they don't exist, v'she'eno mina, and the sauce, Rabba Olav, is going to overwhelm the contaminated meatball, u'mevatel, and be mevatel it, and now the pot of meatballs should be kosher. And that argues on Rav. Rava can't really, he can technically argue on Rav, but, Rav is much older than Rava, but these things are contradicting, apparently. So Amar Le, so Ravina responds, no, they don't contradict. They don't contradict. Rava and Rav could be aligned. So why is Rav saying that the whole pot of meatballs is Issur? Why don't we say, it's min v'mino v'davar acher? Amar Le, you could skip dinafal here and on the next line. I birotev raka, if we're talking about a liquidy sauce, so Rav would agree that it's mutter. Rav would agree that we would say min v'mino v'davar acher, and the contaminated meatball would be batel. Hachinami, it would be fine. It would be kosher. The reason why Rav is saying that the entire pot of meatballs is contaminated, we're talking about a thick sauce. What's so thick about this sauce? There's meat in it. This sauce is thick with little bits of meat and fat. It's a very fleshiga sauce. And therefore, it's all considered min vimino vimormino. The sauce is not considered davar acher. It's considered part of the same thing. You have meat, more meat, and even more meat. That's, that's a significant component of the sauce. And therefore, it's just lots of meat, and that contaminated meatball, min bimino lo batil, Rav holds like Rabbi Yehuda, that contaminated meatball is not going to be batil. Okay, givaldig. So again, Rav holds Chaticha naises neveilah, that drop of milk is going to fall on the meatball, contaminating the meatball, which will in turn contaminate all the meatballs. Umaykasover, what does Rav hold with the following concept? Ikasover efshir lisochato mutter. Efshir lisochato, literally possible to juice it, so to speak, to release its juices, meaning this meatball that absorbed the milk, If you continue to cook it, that milk will diffuse from that meatball and spread and make its way throughout all of the meatballs. So meaning, just like we said in the Mishnah, if before the drop has an opportunity to be absorbed, you kind of mixed it throughout all of the meatballs. So we'll say that the milk is spread throughout all the meatballs, and there would have to be enough milk to be tasted among all of the meatballs. Now, if you say that once a drop of milk gets absorbed in one meatball, it can then diffuse throughout the entire pot of meatballs, well then what's the big deal? Even though, yes, this one meatball got contaminated, ultimately that milk is going to diffuse out of the meatball throughout the entire pot, and therefore we should say, is there enough milk to be tasted in the entire pot? Not that this particular milk should now, not that this particular meatball should now be neveilah and make the entire pot issur because min b'mino lo batil. No, it should be considered throughout the entire pot, and it's a question is there enough milk to be tasted throughout the entire pot, not just its particular meatball. So if he holds that if the flavor can be diffused throughout the entire pot, so we're not just looking at this one meatball being contaminated, but at the entire pot, if the milk could be tasted in the entire pot. Chaticha, amai naisis neveilah. If that's the case, then why is Rav saying Chaticha naisis neveilah, that this meatball is neveilah and min b'mino lo batil, all of the meatballs are issur? Why? Ela kasavar efshir l'sochto issur. Rather, Rav holds that even if that drop of milk can be diffused throughout the entire pot, doesn't matter. Once that one meatball gets contaminated, that's it. It's contaminated. Done. It's neveilah. There's neveilah in the pot. Min b'mino lo batil. All of the meatballs are issur. The idma that was stated, Reb Chanina, Reb Yochanan, Reb Chanina and Reb Yochanan, Damri efshir l'sochto issur, they all say efshir l'sochto is issur. Shmuel, Reb Shimon, Bar Rebbe v'Rish Lakish, Damri efshir l'sochto mutter. They say that no, if in this case, the drop of milk after being absorbed by the meatball can now be diffused throughout all of the meatballs, well then it would be mutter, right? In that, right, we would not say Chaticha naisis neveilah by this particular meatball, and the question would be, is there tam in all of the meatballs? Givaldik. Okay, so Rav holds efshir l'sochto is issur, and therefore that meatball, once it absorbs the drop of milk, is neveilah, and one neveilah meatball mixed among 99 kosher meatballs doesn't matter. Min b'mino lo batil, all the meatballs are issur. And now we discuss the interesting concept of one meatball that falls into a pot of milk. A meatball that falls into a pot of milk. The Savar Rab efshir l'sochto issur, does Rav really hold that efshir l'sochato is issur? That when a drop of milk falls on that meatball and contaminates that meatball, it immediately becomes neveilah? Ve'idmar was stated, kazayis basar shenafal l'soch yore shel cholav. A kazayis of meat. Let's say a meatball. Let's just assume that the meatball is a kazayis. We could keep on talking about our meatball. So our meatball that falls into a pot of milk. You have milk, it's cooking on the stove, and a meatball falls into the pot of milk. Amar Rav, says Rav, basar issur, the meatball is issur, right? Because it's a pot full of milk. That the meatball is going to absorb the milk. Basar b'chalav, the meatball is issur. B'chalav mutter. The milk, however, there's a lot more milk than there's meatball, and any flavor from the meatball or whatever doesn't matter. It's going to be bottled in the milk. The milk is fine. The meatball is not fine. The milk is fine. There's a lot more milk than meatball. Now, here's the question, though. The question is, if it enters your mind like we've been saying that according to Rab, efshir l'sochato osir, and that once this meatball absorbs the milk from the pot, this meatball is neveilah. Even though theoretically, you could put the meatball, the milk in the meatball can diffuse out of it. Once the milk is absorbed into the meatball, that meatball, as far as Rab is concerned, that meatball is neveilah. But if you say that, well then that means that any milk that gets absorbed by the meatball and becomes part of the meatball is also neveilah, right? The meatball is neveilah, the meatball and everything in it. The meat, any milk that's absorbed is also neveilah. Well, if that's the case, then what happens then when inevitably some of that milk from the meatball is going to diffuse back in to the rest of the milk, and that milk that got diffused back into the rest of the milk is neveilah, because it was in the meatball. Now you have neveilah milk mixing with the rest of the milk, min bimino lo batil, and all of the milk now is asur. So from the fact that Rab says that the meatball is asur but the milk is mutter, clearly he's not concerned about neveilah milk from the meatball contaminating all the rest of the milk, which therefore sounds like Rav would be saying that that milk that got absorbed in the meatball is actually not neveilah, because the meatball is not neveilah, which challenges our notion of efshir l'sochato asur. That we said that according to Rav, even though the milk can be diffused out of the meatball is neveilah. But if that's the case, then how do we explain Rav saying that the milk in the pot is mutter? What about the fact that some of the milk that was absorbed in this allegedly neveilah meatball is going to mix back in with the rest of the milk in the pot and min b'mina lo batu? So amai mutter chalav neveilu, you can have milk, neveilah milk mixing with the rest of the milk in the pot. Le'olam kasav Rav efshir l'sochato asur. And for the Gemara, look, what we said is correct. Rav does hold like we said he holds. Efshir l'sochato is asur, and this meatball is neveilah, and any milk that got absorbed in the meatball is also neveilah. The shiny awesome, but it's different over there because, suggests the Gemara, the Omar Kra lo savashal gedi b'chalev imo gedi asur Torah v'lo chalav. The main concern with basar b'chalav is the meat. We're going to reject this. But the main concern with basar b'chalav is the meat. Lo savashal gedi b'chalev imo. What we care about is the meat. And when this meatball falls into the pot of milk, it's the meat that we care about. It's the meatball that we care about. The meatball is going to soak up the milk, and it's asur. The milk is not asur in this. Right? When you have basar b'chalav, the basar is what becomes asur. The chalav does not. And the chalav is fine. But fact the Gemara, be'emet, v'savar Rav gedi asur Torah v'lo chalav. Be'emet, Rav holds that when it comes to basar b'chalav, it's the basar that's asur, the chalav is mutter. Va'idma, but we stated chatzi zayis basar v'chatzi zayis chalav. Shebishlan zeim zeh. A half a zayis of meat, a half a zayis of milk that are cooked together. Amarav says, Rav, loke al achilaso, you will be chayav for eating that half zayis of milk and that half zayis of meat. Ve'ena loka al bishula, but for cooking it, you're not chayav makis. The question is why, right? When it comes to basar b'chalav, you're not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to cook it, you're not allowed to get benefit from it. So why would you be chayav makis for eating it but not for cooking? Aren't those equally asur? So the Gemara is going to talk about that in a minute. But for now, let's focus on the fact that Rav says that if all you ate was half a zayis of meat and half a zayis of milk, you're chayav makis. But if this theory is correct, that the meat is asur, the milk isn't, well, you only ate half a zayis of meat. Why does he get makis? Chatzi shiru. You only ate half a zayis of meat. Why should you be chayv makis for that? You can only be chayv makis if you for achila, if you eat a kizayis. So ela le'olam kasav Rab chalav nami asur. Okay, no. Basar b'chalav applies to the basar and the chalav. Okay. So if basar b'chalav applies to the basar and the chalav, so again, going back to our meatball that falls into the pot of milk, and if we say efshel l'sochto asur, that this meatball that absorbs the milk becomes neveilah, so then the question was, whatever milk was absorbed in the meatball and is therefore neveilah, and therefore is if that milk is diffused back into the pot of milk, so you have milk in the pot, some of which is neveilah, min b'mino lo batil, we should say that all of the milk is asur, and yet Rab says the milk is mutter. How come? After all, we just said when it comes to basar b'chalav, the basar and the chalav are both asur. Listen to this. You hear this? Well, the meatball fell into a boiling pot of milk. The milk was boiling. That because the milk is boiling, when this meatball falls into the milk, it is going to absorb from the milk, but will not expel, let's call it, milk. The milk that it absorbed will not be expelled back in to the milk. We're going to talk about this more practically speaking in a minute. But says the Gemara, because we're talking about a boiling pot of milk, this meatball is going to absorb the milk into it, but won't expel any of the milk back into the rest of the milk. And therefore there's no concern. So while Rav says yes, that meatball is neveilah, and any milk it absorbs is neveilah, but there's no concern that milk that's neveilah is going to be diffused back in to the rest of the boiling milk. It's a one-way thing for the milk. So if sof kinayich hadar palit, okay, but when the milk is no longer boiling, the flavors will diffuse back in to the milk, right? We're saying it's only not going to diffuse because it's boiling. When it stops boiling, so the milk, the neveilah milk, is going to diffuse back into the milk, into the rest of the milk in the pot. Kishakodim V'silko, says the Gemara, it's talking about, well, by that time he had already pulled out the meatball, and there's no concern of any of the absorbed milk, that's neveilah, diffusing back into the rest of the milk. So again, because the milk was boiling, there's no concern of the absorbed milk diffusing back into the rest of the milk. Tosfos Asakashi says, 1 second though. If I take vegetables and Tosfos is saying, 1 second, my observation seems to contradict the claim of the Gemara, says Tosfos. If I take vegetables, for example, put them in a pot of boiling water, the boiling water is going to change colors. Clearly something from the vegetables is being diffused into the water. Shouldn't we be concerned that the milk from the meatball is going to be diffused back in the water? So Tosfos gives one answer, then challenges it. So I'm not going to get into that answer. Tosfos gives a second answer from Rabbeinu Tam, who says, well, yes, what you observed is obviously correct because you observed it. If you boil vegetables in hot water, yeah, the water is going to change colors. But what's happening is that there's an exchange going on between the liquid and, in our case, between the milk and the meatball. In the case of the vegetables, between the water and the vegetables. What's happening is the meatball is absorbing from the milk and diffusing from the meatball. So there's like an exchange of sorts. The fats and flavors from the meatball are going to go into the milk, and the meatball is going to absorb from the milk. The milk is going to be absorbed into the meatball. So yes, there is going to be an exchange, and yes, in the boiling water or the boiling milk, the meatball is going to be diffusing into the boiling milk. But what it absorbs is only going to be absorbed. It is not going to diffuse. And therefore, we're saying as long as the milk is boiling, so the meatball will absorb the milk, and some of the meat is going to diffuse into the milk. The meatball is going to absorb milk, but won't diffuse any of the milk. It'll diffuse some fats and meat, but not the milk. The milk is going to stay in the meatball as long as the milk is boiling. And we're saying that you then removed the meatball by the time the milk stopped boiling. So therefore, all that milk that was absorbed remained in the meatball. And yes, some of the flavor from the meatball and the fats were diffused into the milk that was boiling. But as long as there's enough milk, it'll be mavato, right? Beshishin. If the meat is nosin tam in the milk, so it'll be also, but otherwise it will be bottle, and that would be considered okay. Tosfos then says something very, very interesting, lemaise, which is, let's say you're eating cholent on Shabbos, your hot cholent with flanken in it, with meat in it, and you use a metal dairy spoon, right? You take out a spoon and you're eating your cholent, and you realize, oh, wait a second, this is a dairy spoon, and my dairy spoon just absorbed the meat from the cholent. So what do? So Motzai Shabbos, you boil up a pot of water, so you can do agalas kelim. And you'll boil up a pot of water. You'll take your metal fork, and you'll drop it into the pot of boiling water, and you do agalas kelim. So Tosfos says, you have to make sure that there's 60 times the amount of water in to the fork, because that fork is ben yomo, right? It was from today, from this afternoon when you were eating cholent. And as we're saying that there's going to be a sort of exchange of flavors. So what's going to happen is that fork is going to absorb from the water, but expel from it. It's going to expel its flavor, which is ben yomo from that day, into the boiling water. And then that water that's mixed into the boiling water, the flavor that's mixed into the boiling water, could then be either reabsorbed into the fork, or if you have other things that you want to then do agala, maybe you gave everybody a dairy fork, so now there's multiple forks that you want to drop in. But if there's not shishim, after you drop in the first one, so then the rest of the water is going to become contaminated with the flavor from the first one. So, and then the subsequent ones, you're basically going to be doing agalas kelim in Issur waters. So therefore, you have to make sure, says Tosfos, that if you're going to be doing agalas kelim, make sure that you have 60 times the amount of hot water to whatever you are koshering in your pot, to make sure that whatever is released from the utensils, there would be enough water to be mevatel that flavor. And finally, getting back to the question of why did Rav say that when you cook half a zayis of meat and half a zayis of milk together, if you eat it, you're chayiv makis, but if you cook it, you're not? What should be the difference? If it's also, you should be chayiv makis for both. If it's not also, you should be chayiv makis for neither. Gufa, we said earlier, chatzi zayis bosu v'chatzi zayis cholav shebishlan zebazeh zeimzeh. If you cook together a half a zayis of meat and a half a zayis of milk, Rav says, Rav loka al achilaso, you'll get makis for eating it. Veinu loka al bishula, but you're not chayiv makis for having cooked it together. Monashach, I don't understand. If the two half zayises join together, the half zayis of meat, the half zayis of milk, abishul nami leelke, then you should be chayiv makis for cooking a kazayis of basar b'chalav, essentially. If they don't join together, you should not be chayiv for eating it either. You ate half a zayis of each and they don't join together. And for the Gemara, the olam, according to Rav, lo mitztarfe. They don't join together. And that's why when you cook half a zayis of meat and half a zayis of milk, you're potter. And theoretically, if you would then eat it, you'd also be pater. But the reason why Rav says that you're chayiv for eating it is because when he was talking about eating half a zayis of basar and half a zayis of chalav, it was talking about where it came from a bigger pot. You had mamish, a big pot of basar b'chalav. You were mamish cooking meat in milk. You then ate a half a zayis of that meat and a half a zayis of that milk. So in that case, it's mamish, you have two isurim, and it's the same isurim. It's not like if you eat half a zayis of neveilah and half a zayis of treifa, whatever, two different isurim. No. Here Ramam is talking about, it's all basar b'chalav. It's coming from a big pot of literally basar cooked in chalav. And you're taking a half a zayis from the meat, a half a zayis from the milk, but it's basically a half a zayis of basar b'chalav and another half a zayis of basar b'chalav. And you're eating a whole zayis of basar b'chalav. So Rav says, yeah, in that case, you're going to be chayiv for eating as a kazayis of basar b'chalav. But if you would just cook together a half a zayis of basar and a half a zayis of chalav, and that's the whole thing, a half a zayis of each, they would not join together. And I imagine if you then eat that, you would not be chayiv makis either, because they don't join together. The Levi Omar says, Levi, Af loka al bishulo, you would be chayiv, you would even be chayiv for cooking a half zayis of meat and a half zayis of milk together. In fact, he says af loka, I imagine you'd be then also chayiv for eating just a half zayis of meat and half zayis of milk that were cooked together. B'chein tani Levi b'masnisa, Levi taught in a brisa, I imagine his brisas, Levi had his own toseftas. Kishim shaloka al achilaso, just like you would be chayiv makis for eating half a zayis of meat and half a zayis of milk, kachloka al bishulo, you'd be chayiv for just cooking a half zayis of meat and a half zayis of milk. Uveza bishul, and what would be considered bishul here? Amru bebishul shacherim ochlin also machmas bishulo, a bishul that others would eat it. I mean, he cooked enough that others would eat it. Of the kochavim, people who don't need to, who aren't concerned about basar b'chalav, cooked enough that they would be interested in eating it. So once it's cooked enough that they'd be interested in eating it, it would be asur for basar b'chalav. The Rambam Taka paskins like Levi, that even cooking half a zayis of basar and half a zayis of chalav is asur. And the Magid Mishnah and the Rambam says, interestingly, because between Rav and Levi, we paskin like Levi, which is a good tidbit to take away, that Rav and Levi paskin like Levi, and therefore the Rambam paskins like Levi, that cooking a half zayis of meat and half zayis of milk together, you would be chayiv makis for that. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Ches of Masechta Chullin. Well, Daf Kuf Ches was really something else. We had 5 sections, each one very, very interesting. The first one being eating meat and milk at the same table. We say it's okay if you don't know each other, because there's no concern that you're going to take from each other's food. Now, if you do know each other, it's okay if you make a visible distinction, right? If you have placemats or you put something between where the person wherever the meat is being eaten and the milk is being eaten. So as long as you make a visual distinction, then it would be okay to then be at the same table. We discussed flavor in Issur veheter. We said that tamo v'lo mamosho, tam ki'ikr, is asur midoraisa by basar b'chalav, and it is also asur midoraisa by, for example, pork flavor. Abai wanted to learn out the pork flavor from basar b'chalav. Rava said it's not necessarily a raya from there, but he does agree, however, that tam ki'ikr is asur midoraisa. Chaticha naisa neveilah, right? Rav said that if you have a drop of milk that falls on one meatball, that meatball becomes neveilah, and then all of the other meatballs are also, because, according to Rav, min bimino lo batil, he passes like Rav Yehuda. This then brought up the concept of efshir l'sochto, if that flavor can then be diffused in the rest of the dish, to move through that meatball and be diffused in the rest of the dish. Does that make a difference? According to Rav, it doesn't make a difference. According to others, it's mutter. According to Rav, it's Issur, and that meatball is neveilah. We then moved on to the question of an Issur falling into boiling heter, right? So if you have a meatball that falls into a pot of boiling milk, so Rav says that the meatball is Issur, but the milk is mutter. The question is, why is that? Don't we have to be concerned about, since the meatball would be considered neveilah, any milk that got absorbed in it would be neveilah, and if it then leaks back into the rest of the milk, it would make all the milk Issur, because min b'mino lo batil, and all of the milk should then be Issur. So we said that, well, since the milk was boiling, so what happens is the meatball will absorb milk, but will not release it back into the milk. Tosfos then asked, but we see that when you boil things, some of what's being boiled does diffuse into what is being boiled in. So therefore, we should be concerned about the milk being released back into the milk that is being boiled in from the meatball. Rabbeinu Tam says, well, what happens is there's kind of an exchange. There's a transfer of flavors. The milk will be absorbed in the meatball, and yes, the meatball, the meat and the fats will be dissolved in and absorbed into the milk. But the milk that's absorbed in the meatball will stay in there, and therefore, as long as you take that meatball out of the milk, there's no concern that any of the milk that was absorbed in the meatball went back into the milk. Which then was an interesting point that came up in Tosfos, is that if you do agolas kelim, you want to make sure that you have at least shishim of water, so that anything that is expelled, any flavors that are expelled from what you're boiling, from what you're koshering, will be bottle in the water that you're boiling it in. And finally, there's a question of, can Issur and heter join together? If you have half a zayis of meat and half a zayis of milk, Rav says that they don't join together. And therefore, if you cook together a half zayis of meat and a half zayis of milk, you would not be chayiv makis. Now, if you eat half a zayis of meat and half a zayis of milk that came from a larger pot of basar b'chalav, where the meat on its own was Issur and the milk on its own was Issur, so then you basically have half a zayis of basar b'chalav and another half a zayis of basar b'chalav, and you join them together, so then that will be Issur. But just half a zayis and of each would not join together. Levi says that they would join together. If you just cook half a zayis of meat and half a zayis of milk together, you'll be chayiv makis for that. And if you eat it, then there's also a chayiv makis for just doing that. Friends, that was Daf Ches, an unbelievable powerhouse of a daf of Masechta Chullin. Have a great day. Cheers.